Let's get started. Today's daf is a little bit easier, and the reason I think, I mean, you guys can tell me whether you agree or not, but the reason it's a little bit easier is that many of the complicated and complex concepts we're discussing have already been discussed, right? So they're not easy, but hopefully they become a little more familiar as we do them over and over. And just to repeat, today's daf Yud Gimel and Masechet Menachot, and yesterday we did Yud Bet, and yesterday we had a very long Mishnah which reintroduced to us the concept of pigul, right? And remember that the concept of pigul, which is a very abstract concept for us, is essentially an idea that if in the act of doing a karban, you have a thought, not an action, but a thought to do some aspect of the karban inappropriately, it can be pasul, and sometimes it can be chayav karet, right? So remember, if your thought, remember by zvachim, the idea was if you're doing an avoda of the karban, shchita, zrika, whatever, and you think I'm going to bring part that goes on the mizbeach, which is either the blood or the food or the meat that goes, the organs that go on the mizbeach, or eating the food, which is not the mizbeach, but what the person does for most karbanot, I'm going to do that in the wrong time. Then the animal is pigul, and if you do eat the meat the next day or even that day, you're chayiv karet. And if you say in the wrong place, then it's pasul, but it's not karet for eating that meat. Okay, and again, the karet is not for the thought. The karet is for eating the meat in the case of pigul. So yesterday, we carried this forward from animals to talk about menachot, okay? And so we introduced the concept of menachot and the essential avodot of menachot, which are the kmitza of the mincha, the putting it in a kli. You take that kmitza, that flour, and you put it into a kli. You walk to the mizbeach and you burn it on the mizbeach. So those four steps are very similar to the four steps of the regular karban. We're going to get to later today into a fifth step, because there is a fifth step. But our Mishnah today asks the following question. So we're at the Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Bet Amud Bet, not the bottom, 15 lines from the bottom. What if instead of thinking, so remember, for pigul, the other question I just want to remind everyone is that you have to have a thought of doing something significant. And significant in the Mishnah always means a kizayit, right? So if you say, I'm shechting this animal to do it properly, but I'm going to save a little bit for tomorrow, that's not pigul. Because if it's less than a zayit, it's not pigul. Says the Mishnah today, what if you say, le'echol kichatzi zayit, I'm going to eat half of a zayit, which is not enough to make it pigul, and I'm haktir chatzi zayit, I'm going to burn half a zayit. Again, not enough to make it pigul, but can they combine? Says the Mishnah, they do not combine. Kosher. You did not, in fact, the animal's kosher, because you did less than an isser and less than an isser, which is nothing. She'ein achila v'aktara mitztarfinan. Because thinking about eating something in the wrong time and thinking about burning something in the wrong time are not combinable. Now, says the Gemara, that implies, and this is a repeat of a Gemara we had, if you recall, in Masechet Zvachim, and Tosfos here says that he does not think it's been edited as well as the Gemara in Zvachim. So if you have any complaints with the editing of this Gemara, go to Zvachim and do that version. That's what Tosfos says. So anyways, but it's overall a repeat. We're going to do the Girsa in front of us. Ta'ima, the Mishnah implies that it's not pigul because you can't combine half an act of eating and half an act of burning. Ta'ima de le'echol lahaktir. The reason it's not pigul is because one is eating and one is burning it. Ha le'echol v'le'echol davar she'in darko le'echol. Let's say you shechted your animal, let's just pick that example, and you said, I'm going to eat a small piece of it. Well, let's go back to the mincha. The mincha is better, right? So with the mincha, you take a kmitza. The kmitza is supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach, not eaten, right? Let's say you have a thought, I'm going to eat half a portion of the shirayim, the leftover mincha, which I'm supposed to eat, but I eat it tomorrow, and I'm going to eat half of the kmitza tomorrow. You're not supposed to ever eat the kmitza. The kmitza is supposed to be burned. You might think from reading our Mishnah that that's pigul, because even though it's half and a half, they're both eating, and our Mishnah only said it's a problem if it's eating and burning. So you might imply from our Mishnah, and I'll read the Gemara again. The reason it's not pigul is because you're talking about eating and burning. If you say I'm going to eat half a kazayit of a food that you're supposed to eat, like the shirayim, and half a kazayit of food you're not supposed to eat, like the kmitza, mitzarif, it would combine, it would be pigul. That would be very nice. But if you remember yesterday's daf, we learned explicitly yesterday, Katani Reisha, we learned yesterday, which is the beginning of this Mishnah, and now we're quoting, Le'echol davar shedarko le'echol aktir davar shedarko la'aktir. That the only thing that's pigul is if you have a thought to eat what you're supposed to eat in the wrong time, or burn what you're supposed to burn in the wrong time, which implies davar shedarko le'echol in. only things that are supposed to be eaten, but chain darko lechol lo. So how can our mission imply the problem is eating and burning? The previous mission implied the problem was only eating things that are supposed to be eaten. What about this middle case, where you think about eating a portion of food that's not supposed to be eaten? Answers the Gemara, you're right. There's a machloket Tanaim. And our Tana is different than the previous Tana. Man Tana, who's the Tana of our Mishnah? Reb Yirmiyah Hamani, Reb Elazar. Our Tana is Reb Elazar. The Amar, Reb Elazar is going to say, and we're going to have this later in a Mishnah later this week, that Mechashvin Me'achilat Adam, Me'achilat Mizbech, Me'achilat Mizbech, Me'achilat Adam, that you can actually have a machshava about something, saying, I'm going to eat it tomorrow when it's supposed to be eaten by the Mizbeach, or vice versa. I'm going to burn it on the Mizbeach tomorrow when it's supposed to be eaten by me today. Ditznan, as we're going to have in the Mishnah in 4 days. Hakometz et mincha. Let's say you do the kmitza of the mincha with the thought, lechol davar she'in darko lechol, that you're going to eat something that's not supposed to be eaten, like the kmitza, or la'aktir davar she'in darko la'aktir, you're going to burn things that are not supposed to be burnt, like the shirayim, which is supposed to be eaten, not burned. Kasher. It's not a bad machshava because it's irrelevant. And that's the Tanakama, Rebbe Eliezer Posel. So Rebbe Eliezer says it's possible. So in fact, there's a machloket Tanaim between the Tanakama and Rebbe Eliezer about whether thoughts about eating things that are not supposed to be eaten or burning things that are not supposed to be burning is an effective thought. And the first Mishnah made it sound like it's not. And this Mishnah makes it sound like it is. And that's the machloket. Very straightforward. Says Abaya, I don't think that's a great explanation because it's a real, Abaya doesn't say why, but you can imagine one of the reasons might be that it's very strange for our Mishnah to change opinions and not tell you we're changing opinions, right? Why don't you speak out? This is a different Tana. There's no names. So Abaya says, I think it's all the Rabbanan. Afilu tema Rabbanan. And you made the wrong conclusion from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said if you had a thought to eat half a zayit tomorrow and burn half a zayit tomorrow, it doesn't combine. And you said, well, that implies, but if you had a thought to eat half a zayit of edible food tomorrow and half a zayit of non-edible food, it would combine. That's wrong. Lo tema, don't make that conclusion that, now quote, le'echol v'le'echol davar she'ein darko le'echol would combine. Ela ema, what you should read from our Mishnah is that just like you can't eat and burn it tomorrow, also, ha le'echol v'le'echol davar she'ein darko le'echol is sorry, ha le'echol v'le'echol davar she'darko le'echol. That the only thing that's not pigul is if you combine eating and burning. But if you combine eating a piece of this and eating a piece of that, it would be pigul. That's obvious. Mike Kamashmalan. So what's the chiddush? That was the first Mishnah yesterday. Habeheda katani la. We learned in the Mishnah yesterday. Now we're quoting the Mishnah. Le'echol kazayit b'chutz v'kazayit l'machar. If you combine, I'm going to eat a kazayit outside, or kazayit and a kazayit tomorrow, or kazayit l'machar v'kazayit b'chutz, or the third case, kichatzi zayit b'chutz, or kichatzi zayit l'machar, or kichatzi zayit l'machar zayit b'chutz, pasul v'ein bo karet, right? We said in the Mishnah yesterday that if you think I'm going to eat one kazayit outside and one tomorrow, so that's not pigul, because remember, pigul has to be, I'm going to do one part tomorrow and everything else is done properly. But as you saw here, it's only because you said outside and tomorrow. On the top of Yigim Amud Aleph, this is where the Girsa gets very mishubash. I'll just read what we have in front of us. Hatu lamali, right? What's the point of saying that in the Mishnah? If it's telling you lechol v'lechol davar she'ein darko lechol kamash molandim mitzaref, right? If it's telling you that you can combine those things, I already learned mireisha shmamina that you can't combine them, right? And then skip the parentheses. Then I also, if you're telling me our Mishnah today is telling you, oh, you can't combine eating and burning, why do you have to tell me that? Midiyuka dereisha shmamina, right? I would have known that from the first Mishnah of yesterday because I would have thought, again, the Girsa, it's not very clear on the side. We have a different Girsa, but that intent is what I just said. And why do you need our Mishnah to tell you that you cannot combine an act of eating and burning? Dehashta, you would have logically said, we're 6 lines from the top, Ma le'echol v'lechol davar she'ein darko le'echol amrit lo mitzaref. If you're at a thought, I'm bringing this carbon, and tomorrow I'm going to eat a small piece of the shirayim, which is supposed to be eaten today, and I'm going to eat a small piece of the kamitza, which is never supposed to be eaten, it's supposed to be burned. That does not combine to make pigul. So you would have thought, well, if that doesn't combine to make pigul, for sure, half a kazayit eating tomorrow and half a kazayit burning tomorrow will not combine to make pigul. So why do we need our Mishnah? It must be that our Mishnah is not telling you that, right? So let's read that inside. Because the hashta, you would say, look, Ma le'echol v'le'echol davar she'en darko le'echol. Eating a piece you're supposed to eat and eating a piece you're not supposed to eat. Amrit lo mitzaref. If you said they don't combine to make something pigel, le'echol lahaktir mibai. Do you need another Mishnah to then come and tell you, well, if half of it's for eating and half of it's for burning, it also doesn't combine? Obviously, it doesn't combine because they're different things. Says the Gemara, wrong. You need to tell me that in the Mishnah. You need to tell me, le'echol ulahaktir itzrichale. You have to tell me that if you have a thought that you're going to eat half a kazayit tomorrow, and you have a thought, I'm going to burn half a kazayit tomorrow, that it's not pigel. Because sal kazayit lechamina, I might have thought the reason you can't combine eating shirayim and eating the kmitza is hatamhu de lo ki orchei kamechashim. Because the thinking that I'm going to eat the kmitza is wrong. You're not supposed to eat the kmitza ever. You're supposed to burn the kmitza. And so your thought of eating the kmitza is like you did nothing. But here, aval hacha, here where we're talking about burning what you're supposed to burn and eating what you're supposed to eat, hai ki orchei kamechashim, uba hai ki orchei kamechashim. Your thought was proper for each half. So you might think ema litztaref, that they combine, kemash malan, and therefore our Mishnah has to come to tell you, even according to the Chachamim, that it does not combine, because even though a food and eating a proper thing and eating an improper thing do not combine, you might have thought that eating and burning combine, kamashma in our Mishnah, that they do not combine. And so that is Abaye's explanation of the first Mishnah of today. Again, I know it's very confusing, hopefully clear enough. Says the Mishnah now. Now we get to some real fun, exciting stuff. And the reason this is fun and exciting, everything's fun and exciting here, is that I've sort of, me and the Gemara, I'll blame the Gemara as myself, have been sort of confusing things up till today, but today's when it all becomes clear. Because we said over and over that the 4 acts of the mincha parallel the 4 acts of the zevach, right? By a zevach, you do, and I'm going to repeat them many times. You slaughter the animal, you accept the blood in a cup, you walk with it to the mizbeach, and you sprinkle on the mizbeach. Now, of course, with an animal, there's more steps. You got to burn the animal. But as we learned throughout zvachim, burning the animal is not ma'akev, right? Once you pour that blood on the mizbeach, you get a kapara, you can eat the meat, everything is fine. You're supposed to burn parts, right? The emurim. But you've done your 4 avodot, and you got a kapara, right? In a mincha, you have 4 parallel steps. You do a kmitza, which I'm going to say is the parallel of shechting the animal. Of course, we learned last week it's not exactly a parallel because a kohen has to do a kmitza and a zar can do the shechita. You then take the kmitza and put it into a cup, which is the same idea as taking the blood and putting it into a cup. You walk with it to the mizbeach, and then you burn it on the mizbeach, which is the equivalent of zrika, right? So those 4 things are equivalent. Of course, the part that I ignored, that the Gemara ignored till today, is that there's a 5th step with the mincha that you have to do for the mincha to be kosher. And what's the 5th step? Is that the mincha contains flour and oil that you do a kmitza with. But as we learned last week, there's a 3rd component called levona. There's spices on the mincha. And the spices cannot be in the kmitza. Remember, you have to push aside the spices and do the kmitza purely. So once you burn the kmitza on the mizbeach, you have to go and gather those spices up and burn them on the mizbeach. And without doing that, it's not a mincha, right? Now, of course, there's exceptions. Some menachot don't have spices, like the minchat chotei. But if the mincha has spices, what we call a levona, then that's an essential part. And of course, there's no parallel with an animal to levona. It's a 5th step that doesn't exist. And the reason this becomes complicated, I'm giving away a lot of our Mishnah, is that with pigol, the general concept of pigol is that you have to have a thought about that which makes the animal kosher. But by an animal, that's zrikat hadam. By a mincha, that's 2 things. It's putting the kmitza on the mizbeach and putting the levona on the mizbeach. So what about if you think about one and not the other? So that's where our Mishnah comes in. It says the Mishnah today, 2nd parak of Masechet Menachot, hakometz et mincha. The first part sounds very obvious. You do kmitza of a mincha, which is the act, and your thought while you're doing it is, I'm going to eat it tomorrow. Le'echol shira o lahaktir komsa lemachar. I'm going to eat it tomorrow. I'm going to burn it tomorrow. That sounds like pigol, right? But our Mishnah adds a few words. Moda Reb Yossi bezeh. Reb Yossi would admit in this case, now we don't know who Reb Yossi is, you never heard of him before, but Reb Yossi would admit, shehu pigol v'chayavin love karet. Okay. Now, the reason we said that is because of the next words. What if your thought is, I am doing a kmitza of this karban, and I'm going to do the kmitza in 15 minutes the way I'm supposed to. but I'm going to wait till tomorrow to burn the levona on the mizbeach. So now the second line in the Mishnah, lahaktir levonatan lemachar. Your thought is I'm going to burn the levona tomorrow, right? So remember, if you think I'm going to burn the kmitza tomorrow, it's pigel. But your thought is I'm going to burn the levona tomorrow. So there says Rabbi Yossi, it's not pigel. Pasul ve'ein bo karet. Because no, we don't know why. But one idea might be that since your kmitza is with the flour and your thought was about the spices, it doesn't apply. But it's pasul. We don't know why it's pasul, right? But we'll see all this in the Gemara. Chachamim say, what are you talking about? Pigol v'chayavin alav karet. That's pigol, right? Burning the spices is part of the animal, not the animal, part of the mincha. Burning the spices, if you had a thought about burning the spices, it's pigol. And Amrulo, they said to Rabbi Yossi, why is it different than an animal? Mashina zemin hazevach. Why is it different than an animal? Remember, by an animal, you could do this rikat hadam with a thought, or shchita, let's say, that I'm going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow, or I'm going to eat the meat tomorrow, or I'm going to burn the meat, the emurim tomorrow. It's all pigul, right? Because it's all one big thing. You don't have to be thinking about the blood when you're doing the avoda. You could think about the eating. So why is it not the same thing by a mincha? You're thinking about the burning the spices when you're doing the kmitza. Amar lahen. So Rabbi Yossi said back to the Chachamim that there's a big difference because an animal is one object. Shehazevach damo b'saro ve'marav echad. It's one animal. It's got blood. It's got guts. It's got meat. It's all one thing. But levona ina mina mincha. The levona has nothing to do with the mincha. The mincha is the flour and the oil, or maybe just the flour, and the levona is a separate added thing. They're not the same family. It's not like an animal. And therefore, you have to treat them separately. And therefore, thinking about the levona when you do the kmitza does not make it pigel. That's Rabbi Yossi's big chiddush. Says the Gemara now, we just try to unpack the Mishnah, which we clearly explained. Says the Gemara, Lamali the mitzvah moder Rabbi Yossi bezu. Now, why do you have to say Rabbi Yossi had mitz, right? Because Rabbi Yossi was never mentioned before. And it's mishum the kabbai lemitni seifa, because at the end of the Mishnah, we wanted to say that lahaktir levonotan lemachar Rabbi Yossi omer pasul ve'im bo karet. Now, so if you had just learned that, you might have thought the reason Rabbi Yossi says that burning the levona does not make it karet, or thought about burning levona, is not because, as I explained the Mishnah, that the kmitza is the flour and the levona is the spices, right? And so it's separate. You might have thought it's because Rabbi Yossi's opinion is that you have to have a thought about everything. Meaning, your thought to make pigel by a mincha has to be, I'm going to burn the kmitza tomorrow and I'm going to burn the spices tomorrow, right? If you think I'm going to burn one and not the other, maybe that's not enough to make a mincha pigel. In which case, if you did kmitza of a mincha with the thought to burn it tomorrow, that wouldn't be pigel because you have to think I'm going to burn it, the kmitza, and I'm going to burn the levona, right? So you might have thought that. Because you might have thought the last line, time of Rabbi Yossi mishum d'ksaver emifagdim mechatzi matir. Rabbi Yossi's reason for saying it's pigel is because it's only half of the matir. Matir means the part of the animal that brings kapara, right? And since you have two parts by a mincha, the spices and the flour, he might have thought either one is independently not enough to make it pigel. Va'afilo reisha nami. Maybe he argues in the first case too, turn the page, that even if you do kmitza, to burn the kmitza tomorrow, it's not pigel, because you have to think about the levona, kimash malan de bahamoda. Then in fact, that's not Rabbi Yossi's reason. It's not because of half of a matir. It's because the species are different. One is flour and one is spices, and the thought about one won't passel the thought about the other. So that's a big chiddush. Continue the Mishnah, we're at the top, the two dots on the top of Yud Gimel Amud Bet, right? Mishnah continued and said, if your thought was, this is the second part of the Mishnah, the big innovation, lahaktir levonata lemachar. A person does a kmitza of a mincha, he sticks his hand in, takes out a piece and says, I'm doing this to burn it on the mizbeach, and I'm going to bring the spices tomorrow, right? So then Rabbi Yossi says, pasul ve'im bo karet. Amar Reish Lakish, says Reish Lakish, and I want to tell you a very interesting part of Rabbi Yossi. And we'll see why this is innovative or not. Says Reish Lakish, I just want to point out something to you. Where am I? Omer Haya Rabbi Yossi. What Rabbi Yossi's point in the Mishnah is saying is that ein matir mifagilat matir. Rabbi Yossi's point in the Mishnah is not, now this seems a little bit different than what we said a minute ago, but that basically one matir cannot lead to pigel of another matir. So when you have a carbon that has two parts, or three or five or whatever, there's no carbon that has five, but let's just say a carbon that has two or three or more parts that are needed to be matir the carbon, to fulfill the carbon, thinking thoughts about while you're doing one about the other does not make it pigul. And now, what's the chiddush? Obviously, our Mishnah said if you have thoughts while you're doing the kmitza about doing the levona tomorrow, that's not pigul. But there's a couple other examples in the Torah where you have two matirim for a carbon. What are the examples? So we're going to see today two other examples. There might be more. One example, which we're very familiar with because we talked about a lot, are the lechem apanim. Right? Remember that you would put lechem on the shulchan every Shabbos, and you would take it off every Shabbos, right? And the lechem on the shulchan were 12 lechems. They were all eaten by the Kohanim, right? What was put on the mizbeach from the lechem hapanim? There's two bezichim of levona. Remember, there were 2 cups of spices, and they were both put on the mizbeach, but they're of course independent. So let's say you take one of the cups of spices and you pour it on the mizbeach, and while you're doing that, you think, I'm doing this one today, but I'm going to save the other one for tomorrow because I don't know, my friends are coming to visit, right? So that seems to be a question of whether pigul can happen with one matir while you're thinking about another matir. Says Reish Lakish, what Rabbi Yossi is saying in our Mishnah is that when you do a kmitza of a mincha and you have a thought while you're doing the kmitza, I'm going to burn the spices tomorrow, that's not pigul. The reason is because ein matir mifagil matir. Thinking while you're doing one part of the animal, or not animal, the carbon, on another does not cause pigul. And says Rabbi Yossi, therefore, on the 4th line of Daf Yud Gimel Mebet, v'chein ata omer, and therefore, by the same logic, you would say the same thing, b'shnei bezichei levona shel lechem hapanim. You would say the same thing by the 2 cups of spices, by the lechem hapanim. She'ein matir mifagil et matir. That if you have a thought, I'm doing this one today, I'm doing it properly, right? But I'm going to do the other one tomorrow. That's as if you thought nothing. And there's no pigul according to Rabbi Yossi. According to the Chachamim, it would be pigul. But according to Rabbi Yossi, there's no pigul because ein matir mefagil at matir. That is what Reish Lakish said. Says to the Gemara, that seems very obvious, right? My v'chinata omer. Why do you have to tell me that application of the halacha of Rabbi Yossi to the lechem hapanim? Why would you have thought the lechem hapanim would be different? Says the Gemara, because if Reish Lakish had not spoken it out, you might have had a whole different interpretation of why Reish Lakish, why Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah said that if you do a kmitza of a mincha and your thought during the kmitza is I'm going to burn the levona tomorrow, it's not pigul. You know what you might have thought? Ma'adatema, you might have thought Rabbi Yossi b'levona. The reason of Rabbi Yossi that when you think about the levona doesn't become pigul is not because one matir can't permit another matir. It's mishum delav mina de minchahi. It's because it's a different type of object, right? The mincha is flour, the levona is spices. So maybe a thought while you're doing flour can't apply to a thought while you're doing spices. Aval b'shnei bezichei levona, but by the lechem hapanim of the shulchan, where both matirim are the same thing, they're both spices. So maybe demina dahadadi nino, since they are the same species, I mean the same type of object, ema mifagle ahadadi. Maybe according to Rabbi Yossi, if you do one on the mizbeach while you're thinking about the other, it would become pigul. Kimash Milan says Reish Lakish, that's not true. The fact is not that it's not oil, it's flour and spices. The reason it's not pigul is because it's 2 matirim, and thoughts about one can't influence thoughts about the other ones. Says the Gemara, but how could Reish Lakish say that, right? Umi matzid amr time Rabbi Yossi b'levona lav mishum de lav mina de minchahi. How could Reish Lakish come along and say that the reason of Rabbi Yossi, again, just to review, Rabbi Yossi said in the Mishnah that if you do a kmitza of a mincha, right, which is an active avoda, and your thought while you're doing the kmitza, well, let's go back to the ratio of the Mishnah. If your thought about doing the kmitza is, I'm going to burn this on the mizbeach tomorrow, that's called chutz lizmano. That's the definition of pigul, right? And if you eat it tomorrow, eat it today, you're chayiv karet. But Rabbi Yossi then came along and said, if you did the kmitza and your thought was, I'm going to burn the spices tomorrow, it's not pigul. And we said, Reish Lakish said, the reason is because thinking about one matir, which is the kmitza, can't cause pigul about another matir, which is the spices. And the same thing is true about the lechem hapanim. Ask him, is that true? If you read our Mishnah, which we did 10 minutes ago, our Mishnah had a whole different discussion where Rabbi Yossi, the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yossi, well, what are you talking about? It's like an animal which has meat and blood and emurim. And Rabbi Yossi responded and said, well, by an animal, they're all part of one species, but by this, they're not the same thing. It's not because it's a matir and a matir, it's because they're not the same thing. Says Gemara, Mi matzin amrit taimid Rabbi Yossi b'levona. Could you really say that the reason Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold that it's pigel by levona is lav mishum de lav mina de minchi? It's not because it's flour and spices are different. It's because one matir can't permit another matir. Lakatani seifa. If you read the words in our Mishnah, now we're quoting the Mishnah. Amrulo, the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yossi, why would you say that pigel is not effective on the spices? Mashinta min hazevach. Why is this any different than a karban? And Amar Len, Rabbi Yossi answered them, hazevach damo b'saro ve'murav echad. Right? By an animal, it's all one animal. You have blood, you have meat, you have organs, emurim, but levona, mina mincha. Levona is not part of the mincha. So how does Rish Lakish have any explanation of saying? Because according to Rish Lakish, the real reason is not because it's not because it's not the same object. It's because one matir is not mifagel another matir. Answers the Gemara, that is how Rish Lakish would have to understand the Mishnah. My eno min mincha. What does Rabbi Yossi mean when he says that it's not part of the mincha? He means to say it's not eno b'ikuv hamincha. It's not an essential part of the mincha. What does that mean? It's not essential. It is essential, but it means the lav kihecha de ma'akvul kometz l'shirayim. Right? It's not similar. Think about an animal. Right? When you shecht an animal as a karban, in order for that animal to be kosher, for you to eat the animal or burn it on the mizbeach, you have to do the blood, right? So the blood is basically the matir. It's the essential step that makes it a karban. But by mincha, it's not true, right? Because although kmitza is an essential step, kmitza doesn't have to happen first, right? Because, for example, kmitza is an essential step for the shirayim, the leftovers. The kama, now reading inside, kama delav mitkater kometz, as long as you didn't do burn the kometz on the mizbeach, lo metachli shirayim. You can't you can't eat the shirayim. But the same thing is true about the levona. Hachanami ma'akev leila levona. The same thing is true about the levona, that as long as you haven't burnt the levona on the mizbeach, you're not allowed to eat the carbon. The only thing is that you can do either one first, right? There's no sequence that has to happen where either the kmitza has to be burned first or the spices have to be burned first. Either one can be burned first. But the point that the Chachamim are making, Rabbi Yossi is making in the Mishnah, is that it's not an essential step like with the karban, like an animal, where you have to do the blood first, and that permits the meat and the parts, right, to be burned on the mizbeach. By a mincha, you have to do two things, and you can do them in any order that you want. And the two things are independent, right? Burning the spices and burning the kmitza. And because the two things are independent, thoughts about one will not make pigel about the other. And that is what Rabbi Yossi is saying. And therefore, when you come now to the lechem hapanim on Shabbos, you have two cups about the lechem hapanim. You can do either one first. There's no rule that cup A has to go before cup B. And therefore, if you have a machshava during cup A about cup B, it doesn't make it pigel. And so that is how Rish Lakish would have to read our Mishnah. Now, says the Gemara, that makes a lot of sense, I guess. I mean, it doesn't make so much sense, but it makes a ton of sense. But what about the Chachamim, right? Why do the Chachamim say that you can have pigel in this circumstance when, even though it's different parts, even though one, it's a whole animal, is different? And it's very interesting because we don't speak this out, but we're actually going to see later in the Masechta that the Rabbanan agree that ein mefaglin bechatzi matir, right? That if you actually did, if you did pigel on one half of a matir, there's two examples of, I gave you one example of lechem hapanim. The other big example of two matirim, which we're going to quote, and some have it inside here, are the shnei kivsei atzeret, right? So remember on Sukkot, on Shavuos, meaning you brought two animals, two kvasim, two goats, right? Kvasim is a goat. Two goats, I think it's a goat or a lamb, some animal. So, right, some kind of sheep. So you brought two sheep, let's say, on the Mizbeach. And once you did that, the bread that you brought with them was allowed to be eaten by the Kohanim, right? So each one is responsible. If you have a machshava, we're going to see later, ein mefagdim b'chatzi matir, that according to the Chachamim, if you have a machshava about one of them, it doesn't make the lechem pigul unless you do it about both of them. So why would a mincha be different? Says the Gemara, where are we? We're around 15 lines from the top. V'Rabbanan, say the Rabbanan, ki amrinan ein matir mefagil matir, when we say halacha, like I just said to you, and that's all in the parentheses here, that a matir is not mefagel matir. For example, I'm going to read it, even though the Maharsha takes it out. Gabi shachar echad min hakvasim lechol mechaver lemachar damar shneim ksherim, right, where you do shchita of one of the kivsei atzeret with the thought, I'm going to do the other one improperly tomorrow. That means nothing, because thoughts about one don't apply to the other one. But that's only hani mili heichad lo ikfu bechad mana. That's because they're not one object, right? In one pot. When you put them together in one pot, it becomes one thing. And so the mincha actually is not the same as the shnei kivsei atzeret or the two bezichen of alechem apanim, because those things are never combined together. But by the mincha, you basically take a big pot, you put flour and oil and spices into it, and that makes the mincha. And so although you have to independently put the kemitza on the mizbeach and the levon on the mizbeach, it's one mincha, and thoughts about any part of it, when you're doing any part of it, will make it pigul. That's the Chachamim's opinion. Now, so that's sort of the end of our Mishnah. Says the
What does it
Gemara,
mean one pot?
what do I mean by one pot? The way you do the mincha, again, we sort of left out the levona a lot. We discussed it a little bit when you did the kemitza, but the way a mincha was done was all the parts were put together in one kli. So you would put the flour, you'd put the oil, and you'd put the spices together in one kli, and that's the mincha. Then when you do the kemitza, which is
The chometz of flour,
no, all the flour, the ephah, the
all the
asirte,
flour.
right? You take all the flour, which we discussed last week is around 50 eggs worth of flour, or 6 pounds or something we said. So, or 4 pounds, sorry, a good amount of flour. And oil, which depends on the mincha. We'll see how much oil you brought, but a good amount of oil, and spices, and you put it all together in one pot, in one kli. Then you dig your hand in and do the kemitza of the flour and oil combination, but you leave out the spices.
You mix the oil and the flour together before adding that?
So different menachot have we have the next 100 days to learn that. So, well, meaning sometimes you put the flour in first, the oil in first, and then the flour. Sometimes you put part of the oil in first. Some minchot you add oil later, because there's different kinds of mincha, right? Some are oily and some are less oily. So we'll discuss it as we go. Okay.
Then you take the kemitza from that pot and put it on the mizbeach, and then you
Correct.
put your hand back in the pot and grab some levona.
You did it all wrong, James. You take the kemitza from that pot and you put it in a different pot. That's essential. So we learned last week, you're not allowed to take the kemitza and just walk to the mizbeach and put it on the mizbeach. You have to put it into a second kli, which is where the kemitza kli, walk with that to the mizbeach and then put it on the mizbeach.
And then you walk back.
Then you walk back and you take off the spices and put those on the mizbeach.
Why isn't that one? Why don't you take the kemitza and put it in the pot, then take levona and put it in the pot?
I don't remember if you put the spices in a pot, but it has to be separate.
But Rabbi Yossi is saying, or the Rabbanim are saying, it's a single thing. You're just taking them out separately.
Correct. And so if you have a thought when you're doing the kemitza of the flour that you're going to do the levona in the wrong time, that's considered pigul because it's the same carbon. Now, ask the Gemara right after the parentheses, one line down, right? Amar Rabbi Yanai, okay? What if, just James, it was good to you ask that, because what if
you have to move the levona aside? David learned it with the third week. You have to move it aside so you don't touch it, and then you put your hand in and take the kemitza. So the levona is in there, mixed together, but then you have to separate. And he showed us pictures of the levona. He brought pictures from the internet so that, and how you can, and you have to make sure that there's no levona in the kemitza that you take, but it's originally in the same pot.
Correct. Got that, James? We're all in agreement. The question now becomes the next step. Now, it doesn't have to be the next step, but I'm going to make it the next step. After you took the kemitza, you put it in a new pot, you put it on the mizbeach. You then have to come back and take the spices off and put those in the mizbeach, right? So what if a zar, a non-Kohen came and said, I can help. I'll pick out the spices and I'll hand them to the Kohen. So he doesn't have to go in and pick out the spices because maybe some of them got mixed in or got ruined, right? So it says Reb Yanai, Reb Yanai, liket levona bizar pasul. If a zar goes in and picks up the spices to give to the Kohen to put on the mizbeach, that's pasul because a zar is not allowed to be involved in this process, right? Amr Reb Yirmiyah, why is that? It's mishum holacha naguba. Because remember, there are four steps in a carbon. There's kmitza, nitinat kli, holachat in the mizbeach, walking to the mizbeach, and burning it on the mizbeach. Which step is the zar doing at this point? He's not doing kmitza. He's not putting it in a kli. He's handing it to the kohen. But it's as if he's walking with it. Now, he's not walking anywhere, right? He hands it to a kohen. But the issue is, where am I? Kasavar, because he has to hold holacha shelo beregel shmo holacha. That if you move something without walking, right, you just hand it over, that's considered handing it over. That's considered moving it, right? And holacha bizar pasul. And walking something over with the zar is pasul. So even though the zar didn't actually walk with it, if he does the work of picking it out of the pot and giving it to the kohen, that's an avoda and it passes the whole thing. Amar Rav Mari, now says Rav Mari, in fact, I have a braita that supports that, and it's the braita we had 2 days ago. Afananami Tanina. It's actually a Mishnah. We learned that in the Mishnah. Ze'aklal, the Mishnah says the following. The four avodot, call it kometz, anyone who does a kamitza, or notain bekli, or puts it into a pot, or molich, or walks with it, or maktir, or burns it, that is an avoda of the mincha. That's what we said 2 days ago. Now says Rav Mari, Bishlama kometz, I understand that kamitza is the equivalent of shchita, hainu shochit. That's an avoda because it's the same as shechting an animal, because you're basically separating out the kedusha from the chol. Molich, I get that walking with the kmitza is the same as walking with the blood. Nami hainu molich. And makdir, burning the kmitza on the mizbeach, hainu zorik. That's the same as throwing the blood on the mizbeach. Ela notein bekli my kavid. I don't get it. Why can't a zar, or why is there an avoda, not a zar, why is there an avoda involved in putting the kmitza into a kli? You're just putting it into a pan. Now you might say, what do you mean? That's the same thing as accepting the blood of an animal into a pot, right? Which is kabbalat adam. So why don't you say, where am I? The kometz, Ella notem bekli maika avid, we're the third to last narrow line. Ilema mishum dedabin lekabbalah, you might say this is similar to accepting the blood into a pan. But midami, that's not the same thing. Remember, taking blood happens on its own. The blood spurts out. Hata memela, hachlaka shakal varami. Here you're actually doing it, taking it and placing it inside. Right? Blood, you don't make the blood spurt into the pan. You shech the animal, the blood spurts out, you put a cup under it and it accepts it. But here you're actually taking the kmitza and putting it into a kli. So there's no parallel. That's his question, right? Ella, it must be mishum dekivan delosagila avidla avodah chashuvahu. Since it's impossible not to do it, because taking the kmitza, you got to get it into the pan. So someone's into the kli. So since it's an essential act, it's considered to be avodah chashuva, and al karchach mashvili kikabbalah. So therefore, we made it like kabbalat adam. Hachanami. So here too, by the taking off the spices of the levona, kivan delosagin delo avidla. Since it's impossible to fulfill a mincha without taking off the spices, you got to take off the spices to burn them on the mizbeach. Therefore, avodah chashuvahi and al karchach mashvile ki holacha. So therefore,
Why was it impossible with the kamitza?
it's impossible you have to burn the spices on the mizbeach, right? The only way to burn the spices on the mizbeach is to go into the pan, take out the spices, and put them and bring them to the mizbeach. So since it's an essential step, it's not an extra. It's not like you're embellishing and making it more beautiful. You're doing an essential act. It's considered part of the avoda, and if it's done by a zar, it's not kosher. So that's what his proof was. Says the Gemara, no, that's not a really good proof at all, because it's very possible. La'olam, end of second wide line. La'olam dami likabbalah. The truth is that I would say to you that taking a kmitza in my hand and putting it into a pan, into a pot, is the exact same thing as taking a pot and accepting the blood after an animal was slaughtered and it's spurting out, right? You said, oh, it's very different because one happens on its own and one happens by action. What's the big deal? Says the Gemara, the Kashalach, you're going to ask Rami. One happens passively and one happens actively. Michti, look, when it comes down to it, Tervayo Kedushat Klihu. The thing that is important here is that they get into the pan, into the Kli. Mali Mamela, Mali Kashakal Varami. What's the big difference whether you put it in on its own or it happens with action? There is no real big difference between those two. And therefore, you can't prove from here that every action that is necessary for a carbon automatically becomes an avoda. And so, according to that opinion, we don't have a resolution. We don't know at the end of the day. Now, again, earlier, Rebbe Yanai said it's a problem. But according to the opinion we just quoted, you can't prove one way or the other whether a zar who walks up to a mincha and takes out the spices in order to give them to a kohen, but he doesn't walk anywhere with them, he doesn't put them on the mizbeach, is that an avoda and does it passel the carbon or not? Right? He's just trying to help. The question is, does it passel the carbon? And according to this opinion, you can't prove one way or the other. According to Reb Yanai, it's a problem. It's for sure a problem. I'm going to read the Mishnah if that's okay, just for 2 minutes.
Does zar can do shechita though for an animal?
Yes.
Yes, a zar can do shechita, but a zar cannot do kmitza. So that's the one, when we say that they're very similar, they are not similar in that regard. But that's an interesting point.
Right. But does that ruin doesn't that ruin Rabbi Yanai's argument that if it's necessary, then it has to be kedusha and it can't be done by a zar?
It does ruin that argument, but Rabbi Yanai would say that there's a pasuk that specifically permits a shechita, but everything else about it, meat from shechita and on, would be a problem. Yes, it does go against the argument because you have to obviously shecht it. I'm going to read the Mishnah, although I'll read it again tomorrow morning, but let's just do it in 2 minutes, okay? Says the Mishnah, which is a continuation of this discussion. What happens when it's not so simple, right? Pigel, we talked about yesterday, was very simple. You do an act in an animal, in a carbon, or in a mincha, or a zevach, in order to do something wrong tomorrow, some other part of it tomorrow. That's pigel, right? But what if the animal is more complex? Let's read the Mishnah. Shachat shnei kivasim, right? Remember, I told you that on Shavuos, you brought 2 kivsei atzeret, shnei kivsei atzeret. And you had to do both of them in order to fulfill the carbon and eat the chalot. But you did, when you shechted the kvasim, your thought was I'm going to eat one of the loaves tomorrow. Remember, there are 2 loaves of the atzeret. Your thought was, I'm going to eat one of them tomorrow. So is that the whole thing or half? We'll see in the Gemara. Or hiktir shnei bezichim, or you're maktir the bezichim on the lechem apanim on Shabbos. Lechol echad min astarim lemachar. You say, I'm going to eat one of the portions of it tomorrow. Reb Yossi says, well, it's pigel, but the pigel is only the part that you thought about. Oto achala v'oto aseder shechishev alav pigel v'chayav alav karet. The one that you thought about becomes pigel, either the lechem or the shtei lechem, whatever it is. And if you eat that, you're chayav karet. But hasheni pasul v'eimbo karet. But the second one, meaning either the second set of loaves or the second loaf of atzeret, is pasul because you had a bad thought when you did the carbon. But aimbo karet, you don't get karet because its pigel was only about the one you thought about. The chachamim omrim, no. Zev is a pigel, v'chayavin alav karet. They are both pigel and you're chayav karet because you thought about part of the carbon makes the whole carbon pigel, and therefore if you eat it, you're chayav karet. And I'm going to stop here because it's a very lengthy Gemara.
Tell me, what's the nafkamina? How many times can a person get karet? If he gets it for the one and not for the other one, or if he gets it both of them, what difference does it make?
No. If you eat one, let's say there's 2 loaves, right? You do the shechita on the thought that I'm going to eat loaf A tomorrow. Says Rabbi Yossi, loaf A is pigel and loaf B is not pigel. So if you eat loaf B, you're not chayav karet at all. You're only chayav karet if you eat loaf A. Remember, pigel is not for doing the act of shechita. Pigel is for eating the thing that was pigel.
That's right.
So if you eat one that's not pigel, you're not chayav karet. So now you didn't do the good thing, but you're not chayav karet.
Is it okay to eat the puzzle thing?
No, it's not okay. It's puzzle. You have to get rid of it. You have to throw it away.
But one opinion says if you eat one of them, it's pigel.
According to the Chachamim, either one is pigel
Right.
because the carbon became pigel. The whole part of the carbon is pigel, and any loaf that you eat becomes pigel, and you're chayav karet.
Right. So the other opinion says you need to eat both of them, right?
No, you just need to eat the one that's pigel, not both. Remember, there's 2 loaves,
Right.
A and B. So you had a thought that number A I'm going to eat tomorrow. According to Rabbi Yossi, if you eat A, that's pigel, and you're chayav karet. According to the Chachamim, A and B are both pigel, and either one you eat is a chayav karet. You don't have to eat both. You have to eat either one.
So in the end, it doesn't
Thank
make
you,
any
Ali.
difference. Doesn't make any difference. Well, if a person has pickle once, whether he eats this one or that one, doesn't matter then if he eats. I mean, it's how many times can a person get karet?
If you don't eat any of them, you're not chayiv karet at all. You're only
Yeah,
chayiv karet
exactly. But if you eat one of them, it doesn't matter which one. And the
according
other
to the
opinion
Chachamim.
says you eat, it can be one that on which you have it versus the one you don't have it. I mean, once you get a person who's karet, how many times can you get karet?
I don't understand. You have two loaves, A and B. According to the Chachamim, if you eat either one, you're chayiv karet. You just eat one of them. Anyone either. According to Rabbi Yossi, if you eat the pickle one, which is A, you're chayiv karet. If you eat B, which is not the pickle one, you're not chayiv karet. So, but that's the Mishnah. Tomorrow we're gonna have a long Gemara talking about this, which we're gonna add more complexity. So
I'm
hope
just saying, if a
everyone.
person eats one, then he goes back and eats the second one.
No, he doesn't eat the second one. You're only eating one of them.
Right, but
Don't eat both. You could.
you can only get, and even according to opinion said it could be either one. How many times can he get karet? Once he has karet and he does it tomorrow, the next day, he can only get it one time, right? How many times can a person get karet?
That's a different discussion. You can get, well, let's say once, but you have to eat it in order to get curry. If you don't eat it,
Absolutely.
there's no curry.
Well, if he didn't eat it, sure, but once he ate it, and then once he has karet, if he does it again next week, in 2 weeks, in 3 months, he already had karet. How many times he's right? It doesn't matter anymore.
Okay, so perhaps. Tomorrow morning, 7:45 a.m.
It's a very simple question.
God willing, we'll all be in good weather.